What it do, anime crew? I just finished Call of the Night, and I'm gonna talk about it for a while. I noticed some comments on my last video saying that they wish my content was like edited and stuff like that. I have an edited channel. I'll link the comment as like the top comment. I'll pin it under this video. A comment from my main channel where all my videos are fully edited and scripted, and they have like live action segments. I swear they're more creative and thoughtful. But for now, I just want to rant about this show because I try to rant about every anime I finish as of like a month ago. So, Call of the Night definitely blew away my expectations, which were already pretty high going into it. It's one of those shows that's not regarded super highly. It's seen as like a little bit sleazy, a little bit like low brow. I've heard a lot of people call the writing overly simplistic or amateurish. I actually don't agree with that. I think it is very straightforward, especially towards the beginning as it's establishing all the characters and stuff like that. But the thematic setup is very interesting. Talking about nightlife and exploring your possibilities despite how they might be dangerous while you're still young, and the drawbacks of doing that, and the ways people sort of put each other into boxes, and how that can be detrimental even when you're fitting into a box very well, and how it can sometimes be beneficial. And, sometimes just because you're doing something to help other people appreciate you more, to appeal to other people, doesn't actually mean that thing is bad for you if it's genuinely doing good stuff for you. And I think that's a very common misconception that a lot of people fall into. And like all of these concepts were explored very interestingly through the perspective of the second half of the show, as stuff kind of moved a little bit away from the main romance, and the characters started finding themselves, which makes sense because Nana, what is her name? Nazuna. She's a little bit of a catalyst for Ko's, the main character's self-growth, his self-actualization, and she sort of sparks him to start exploring social interactions more and learning about himself through other people and learning about how other people operate and the things he thinks about the world. It's like very much feels like everything's a coming-of-age story these days, but it is a coming-of-age story where Ko really begins to come into his own and develop his own perspectives on the world. It's absolutely beautiful for that, I think, and the romance aspect was really solid. It was extremely straightforward, especially because Nazuna was mostly putting on a bit of an act at first, almost a manic pixie dream girl type of deal where it's like, I'm going to make your life so much more interesting, and I'm going to show you all the wild sides of everything, and what life's really about. And like she's like this big mysterious figure, and it's all facade, and in that sense her character seems pretty simplistic toward the beginning, but it definitely develops pretty interestingly as the series goes on, and I think it's very effective the way the relationship develops. One of my favorite things they did with it is as they begun to kind of shift the focus of the show away from the relationship in the latter half, there was sort of a bit where Nazuna, that was the point in the series where Nazuna says, stuff's going to get boring for you. You're going to like forget about me. I'm not that important to you. It's just the fact that everything was fresh and new, and I wanted to represent that for you. But in reality, you shouldn't continue seeing me. You shouldn't continue wandering off into the night because it's not actually fun. It's just the new norm for you. And the only thing you liked about it was that it was new. And now like that sort of great recency bias is fading, which is nice because the focus of the show was actually fading away from that main relationship because of the fact that, Nazuna was keeping him at an arm's distance. So I thought that was actually a really effective and crafty timing for that sort of character interaction to come up, for that sort of conflict to come up. And I was really impressed by that. There were a lot of cool writing techniques along those lines. And while this episode to episode writing wasn't always amazing, I found it to overall be pretty solid. The one example of something that I wasn't huge on was the sort of mystery subplot of episode 8, I think, or 9, where they go into the maid cafe. It was a mystery that was pretty predictable, but hey, I mean, there are worse things to be, and that episode ended up having some pretty interesting perspectives. That's the one that sort of delved into the false demonization of doing things to appeal to other people, and how for some people that actually works and that can actually be a healthy practice for them. Very, very interesting stuff. I just kind of love the theming of it. It's something that I'm very interested in. I love how Nazuna sort of encapsulates and embodies the spirit of the night, and how Ko is like such a curious young person, but he just doesn't fit in with anybody else, and he wants to learn about himself, and he sees other people as a way to do that, and he wants to learn about and appreciate other people, but it's hard for him to find common ground, and I think it's really cool, his sort of journey to start doing that, even if, like, yeah, there are going to be a lot of very basic interactions of him being like, what? I don't understand. I'm so dense, like stuff like that. There's going to be a lot of somewhat juvenile interactions between him and Nazuna where she's like being super horny and then he mentions love and then she gets all blushy and then a few minutes later she's being super horny and he mentions love and she gets all blushy and it's like I can see why people think it's simplistic and, not that good, but at the end of the day, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought it was pretty solid. And something else to be mentioned is that it was a show that, more than anything, was focused on establishing a great atmosphere, and this show's strongest point by a country mile is the direction. Itamura, who directed most of Monogatari, like over half of the Monogatari series. I believe he did Tsuki Monogatari all the way up through Owari Monogatari Season 2 until Akiyuki Shinbo retook the reins for Zoku Owari Monogatari. And his style has developed. He worked on the case study of Vanitas, which is another vampire anime like this and like Monogatari. And I really liked a lot of the things he was doing on that, but it felt a little bit too not funny at all. And so I didn't really like it. But this is a great development for him. I feel like this is stronger than Case Study Vanitas in every respect. Itamura employs a lot of techniques here, which I really liked. I actually have like a short list of them. This aesthetic of this show, all the character designs are really striking and appealing. They all have these kind of like tired eyes. They almost all look like insomniacs, which is obviously very thematically relevant. There's the empty streets, lack of background characters, which harkens back to the directorial style of Monogatari. There are the objects like partially obscuring the foreground, usually like metal bars or things of that nature. There's the perfect geometry, the instances of like perfect triangles or perfect squares in the background, oftentimes at parks and stuff. There are the warped shots that kind of twist. There's a lot of fast cuts. There's a lot of awkwardly zoomed out shots. There's a lot of awkwardly timed cuts where it like quickly cuts to something and then cuts to something else. There are a lot of not literal POV shots, but shots that represent the POV of the main character. For example, of Nazuna's assets and such, because this is a pretty horny show. And I really, really, really enjoyed that. There are also cool things being done with the colors. There are, as Crunchy Bagels put it in his video, a lot of non-diegetic color shifts and lighting shifts in this series, and it's actually one of its strongest points. When it comes to the introduction of a character like Anko Iguisu, when she's like sitting there and she's absolutely dominating the frame, and she's dragging off her cigarette, breathing in and out, just the tension of that, and then the release of the tension as she breathes out, and then the entire color palette of the world changes because of the vibe she's radiating, and it's like, it's so fucking good because the environment becomes an externalization of the conversation and of the characters themselves. And what I mean by that is that the environment is painted by these characters as opposed to totally shifted. It's not going to be like a total absurdist change of scenery to represent the character's emotions like you might see in something like Marsh Comes In Like a Lion or Boshi the Rock even. Fooly Cooley, stuff like that. It's a little bit more grounded. They maintain the identity of this city and this nightlife and this just cityscape is what it is, but they paint it with these different colors, these different lightings, and that really goes a super long way in terms of just totally transforming the tone of the setting. The tone of the setting during that scene where that detective girl is introduced that I was just talking about, where it goes kind of brown, almost film noir, it begins stretching towards her, and as she takes the drags off her cigarettes, it slows down, it speeds up, the lighting goes dim, and then as she lights her cigarette, the whole screen lights back up. It's like, as she breathes, you can feel the tension of it throughout the entire scene, and she has an absolutely domineering presence, yet incredibly lonesome at the same time. It's very, very, very well executed. And then even in more subtle ways, as her character is further introduced through the conversation she has with Ko, they go into a diner environment that just sort of really externalizes the aesthetic of her character with all the browns and the sort of, I don't know how to describe the imagery very well. I'm not great at describing aesthetics, but the room looks like a place that character would be in. It looks like the place where a jaded old detective wearing a trench coat who's always dragging off a cigarette would be. An old bar that she would hang out at. So I really, really, really like that. That was one of the strongest points of the show, because when I talk about the directing being super personal and super tied into like the POV subjective perspective of our main character, and how everything, despite not actually physically transforming, everything is painted in a new light depending on the situation he's in and depending on the emotional tenor of the conversation and the characters he's interacting with. The show will oftentimes do super exaggerated character poses, like Nazuna would be like actually like physically like looming over him incredibly awkwardly or unnaturally, and part of that's just because she's a quirky character, but also it serves to communicate through hyperbole the dynamics of the conversation and how Ko feels, somewhat intimidated or aggressed upon or very close to, or, whatever it may be with certain characters. It's very, very interesting that they do that, and they also like to do that with the lighting. The lighting will become much more dramatic, and it will change colors as the conversation goes on, which is very interesting. It makes me want to look more into color theory, because there are a lot of sudden color shifts that were very fascinating to me in this show, especially mid-conversation as it changes, as it becomes more sinister, it might turn something like red, or when he's talking to that detective girl and it becomes a lot more tense and mysterious, it goes into that like noir brown sort of palette. When he first meets Nazuna, it gets like super dramatic when she gets like horny for him. I don't know if you guys know the scene I'm talking about, but it's really, really, really intriguing. And I noticed the blonde guy, the character that was a little bit more happy-go-lucky, you see the night sky transform from like this majestic purple that communicates almost a sense of, majesty, opulence. It's a twilight. It has that ephemeral sort of feeling to it. You see it transform into a more playful, yet still distinctly nighttime blue. As they finally go in and explore they explore their own school after hours, and I really liked that. There were a lot of different shifts in the lighting that represented the characters' emotional states and personalities, and that was absolutely one of the most interesting things about the directing here. There was actually one really weird scene with the Gyaru girl where like everything got super intense super fast, and suddenly the color palette just got like infrared and inverted, and it got like really garish to look at, and like all the characters were blending in except for Ko, who was like standing in opposition to her in the context of the scene, so he was like this bright green sticking out like a sore thumb for the entire scene. Very, very odd, very, very just absurdist stylistic choice, but I really, really enjoyed that kind of stuff. One of the instances I can think of in particular was the night sky changing from purple to duller colors, and then sometimes more like an orangish yellow. More of an orangish yellow when it's a little bit more, how do I say, like demystified, or not quite so magical and mysterious, yet still very inviting and comfortable. Inviting and comfortable. Something that does not describe most of the scenes in this series very well. This series is masterful at communicating an awkward conversational tone with a socially inept main character. Because, as I said, there's the awkward timing of cuts. There's the awkward framing of shots. Characters will, as I said earlier, it's not a literal POV, but when Ko's talking, he will be just in the bottom corner of the screen. And even though he's not looking at himself, he's looking at Nazuna, what that communicates is sort of the idea of your eyes sort of wandering off to the corner of the room and averting eye contact because, you're nervous or you're bashful to say something. And so it shows him in that position. And then sometimes, when it's made to feel insignificant, this is a more common technique, but it zooms out super far. Sometimes just to establish the sort of drama and gravity of a scene, to show it kind of just going all the way through this big empty area where it's just two characters to enhance the intensity of it. It will just show more dramatic scenes from farther away. A lot of times it will frame these scenes with objects in the foreground that have symbolic meaning. Like one time there were the triangles, like the perfect geometry representing the logical rebuttal to all of the blonde guys' like crazy assumptions about the school from Akira and Ko, and they were like in a perfectly symmetrical place. Or a lot of times when characters talk, they'll be behind a fence in the foreground, and that sort of represents them being, boxed in together, feeling very somewhat trapped, stuff like that. Nothing crazy, but it all comes together in a very, very unique directorial experience that's really, 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 really engaging when you're watching just characters fucking talking all the time. You can tell this guy comes from Monogatari, and even though this isn't like technically the best written series I've ever seen, I am just beyond happy that Monogatari directing is back, because I just love that series so much from a visual standpoint, and this definitely feels like we're getting back there. This definitely feels like a breath of fresh air. Last thing I'm going to talk about is thematically, this show is very much, it's a vampire story, so it's very much about lust, urges, shame, people who want to feel the lack of shame, people who feel boxed in or otherwise because of their desires, or they feel like demons or monsters, and people who actually let those desires take over them and let themselves become demons or monsters, people who repress them for too long, and that ends up inadvertently making them worse people in the long run. It's very, very interesting. Very interesting. I love the approach and how it slowly shows this kid who wants to be a rule follower, wants to fit in, but doesn't really understand everybody else, connecting with the side of him that's more honest, connecting with a side of him that's a little bit more vulnerable and willing to take risks and willing to put himself out there, but then gradually him realizing the repercussions of living a riskier life, where you make yourself more vulnerable, where you expose yourself to more adults and you expose yourselves to more people's desires and stuff like that. It gets really messy and it becomes a juggling act, and it's important to not lose sight of why you appreciated it in the first place. Ko, as a main character, is a very curious young man. He is very honest to a fault, and he doesn't totally understand people nor himself, but you can tell he has a burning desire to do so. He wants to explore the night, he wants to explore other people's emotions just as he wants to explore his own, and he's slowly learning how he can do that without becoming a menace that's totally overrun by desire. But speaking of which, listen, I'm an anime fan. A lot of people don't like this show because of the fan service in it. The fan service did personally appeal to me quite a bit. I mean, there was a freaking femboy dominatrix in the last episode. I won't act like I didn't appreciate the sheer quantity of dominant women who know what they want and have really appealing aesthetic personalities in this show. But it's also important to keep in mind that this, like Dandadan, like Chainsaw Man, like Kill la Kill, like so many other great anime with a lot of quote-unquote fan service in them, it is about lust. It is about sexual desire. It is about the difference between love and lust, the difference between friends and friends with benefits, and romantic partners and lovers, and loving somebody as a friend versus loving someone as a partner, and the role that sex can play in terms of sort of blurring those lines and confusing people, but also sometimes motivating them to sprout romantic love. This is definitely just a series exploring human relationships from the point of view of somebody who just doesn't get them at all. So while it starts out pretty simple, I believe it's thematically gotten pretty mature and perceptive as the runtimes ran on. There's a season 2 confirmed, and I'm extremely excited to see it. What did you guys think about this show? You were probably less positive about it than me, but hey, maybe not. Let me know. And also, I liked it how I think it speaks to the commitment to establishing an atmosphere, how sometimes they just totally drop the dialogue and the super heavy editing, and they just drop everything, slap in an insert song, and just go full AMV mode and let the viewer enjoy the scenery and feel out the emotions of the scene. They did that many, many times. Very beautiful.